For our next session, we are going to hear about data-informed brand and consumer relationships from Rachel Tipograph, founder and CEO at Micmac, Sarah Hofstetter, president at Profitero, both of whom are the hosts of our Brave Commerce podcast, and Ashley Becker, vice president of eCommerce and Omni growth, customer growth at KraftHeinz's. Please welcome them to the stage.
I think we might have had either like Pinterest fans or they just really hate us.
They clearly don't listen to the podcast.
Did they think there was a break? Because I'm like personally offended. There was a break?
Oh, there's a break. Okay, yeah. Everyone wants their coffee. Well, hopefully you all signed your disclosure agreements because we are actually live right now. We are recording an episode of Brave Commerce. Hopefully you guys are listeners. Sarah and I started this podcast 2.5 years ago. Now our friends at Adweek distribute us, and we're so grateful for the partnership. And we have the amazing Ashley Becker here from Kraft.
Good afternoon, everyone.
She flew in from Seattle for this.
I did, all the way across the country.
So
hopefully we have some West Coasters out here.
So since we're recording,
or not,
no, New York can't attract them. Since we're recording this live, we're actually going to do an intro, and then we're going to get into it. So welcome to today's episode of Brave Commerce. I'm Rachel Tipograph, the founder and CEO of Micmac.
And I am Sarah Hofstetter, the president of Profitero. And this is a show that talks about what's relevant in e-commerce for today's biggest and most relevant brands. So today we are fortunate to have Ashley Becker, VP of e-commerce and omni-commerce and omni-consumer growth at the KraftHeinz's company. So that's a mouthful.
Yes, it is. Thanks for having me.
But at least I know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, true.
Profitero is a little harder. Anyway, one of the things that Rachel and I have seen over the length of time that we have gotten to know you is the interrelationship between terms like omni and e-commerce. Is it okay? Is it something that we need to be more mindful of? Words matter, and we sometimes use words interchangeably. Talk to us a little bit more about the e-com hat and the omni hat.
Yes, absolutely. While e-commerce is still in my title, I really think that the key term here is omni. As we think about this kind of rapidly evolving environment, consumer solutions and products have come to life in a really big way over the last 2 to 3 years. And that's created a really diverse experience for our consumers. And so I think it's important for us to be thinking within the frame of omni. I think that overarching theme enables us to think more broadly about both what's possible and what could come to life in the future, in the near future, but also helps us to kind of think about the complexity of what's going on right now and today. And I think there's this incredible opportunity to think about the consumer journey in a more kind of detailed, focused way. I think we're missing a lot of opportunity to get to those really bright insights.
So what's getting in the way of that?
I would suggest that it's really how we're aligning our strategy and our structure, our ways of working, so that we can systematically unlock it. So at KraftHeinz's, through our transformation journey, we've taken a number of really substantial steps to bring omni to life in an even bigger way. So a few examples for you. In terms of our functions, we've driven a whole lot more focus within each of kind of our functional expertise areas. So as an example, we've created a creative in-house agency called The Kitchen. We've brought all of our media disciplines together under one media house. We've simplified the brand role so that they're not focusing on fire drills and day-to-day activities, but they can really look at the longer-term brand strategy. We've also identified areas of opportunity where we have gaps in our sort of strategic process. We've created a path to purchase team that's taking the insights and looking at that consumer journey to define the most engaging points with consumers and defining the strategy and the return associated with each of those kind of key points of interaction. We've also broadened our shopper marketing scope so that it's omni shopper marketing. So it's no longer these disparate kind of digital and brick and mortar spaces, but it's a whole team that's looking at the activation end to end for each of our retailers. And on top of that, we're having much more intentional conversations with our retailers and bringing in big leaders and key thought leaders so that we can drive really impactful plans in those JVPs. So we're not sitting in the middle of the year looking at our growth results and unhappy with our investments, we really have strong drivers that are coming to fruition in the way we expected.
So all those disciplines that you just went over,
yes,
when Sarah and I meet with all these brands, we often find that part of that organization sits under a CMO, part of that organization sits under a chief sales officer, a chief commercial officer.
Right.
So at Kraft, does all of this roll up to one person?
A lot of it rolls into our growth organization, but there still are pieces that, fall throughout the company. And I think that is where you've got to have that omni focus. You have to drive that vision and that strategy throughout the organization so that we are actually coming together. So it becomes a forcing mechanism. We are having conversations about getting those right people in the meetings so that we can make sure we're creating that seamless, connected experience. It's a sense of ownership that this is a very complex environment, and we're only going to get it right if we come together. That's the only way the consumer is going to experience a connected experience with us, is if we ourselves are connected and driving against that one cohesive strategy. And it sounds simple when you're sitting up here, right? But what are the actual systematic ways that you're building that into both your brand and in, your retail teams?
We've heard people say that they have rules of engagement. Like, you have a meeting with Walmart, you only can have that meeting if you have a media person and a salesperson in the room. Are you guys going as far as setting those rules of engagement?
Yes, we definitely are. And I think it expands much more broadly than that. We want to make sure we have the digital merchandisers in there. We want to make sure we have the brick and mortar merchandisers in the various media disciplines. But we also want to make sure that we're getting insights folks into the conversation, and that we've got the best in class activation experts in the room, so that we're looking at the interdependencies and the way the channels are interacting, and really having robust conversation about what's possible, right? Getting beyond what we're doing today, but really understanding those interdependencies, I think, is how we're going to get to breakthrough work.
So how many people does it take to screw in a light bulb in a JVP is really the question.
It's as many as it takes. I think is the real answer to that question. Like, we have to have all of those kind of key thought leaders if we're going to get to the right conversations. If you've only got your content lead in the conversation, you're skewing that in one direction. How are we thinking more, broadly? And certainly there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, right? When we think about bringing one KraftHeinz to a conversation, we are having many conversations behind the scenes to make sure that we're aligned, and we've had those appropriate kind of foundational conversations to get to the rich insight and to get to that right conversation. We all know there's a ton of data available. It's all over the place. It's disparate. And for us, it's about placing those bets with the biggest insights and really focusing on getting there, getting to the smart insight that we're going to action upon.
Just to give you props for a second, Sarah and I have the opportunity to see Ashley at work, and it is really phenomenal how you drive stakeholder alignment at Kraft. Like, the meetings before the meetings is where all of the art happens, and I've learned from you in terms of how to drive that across a complex organization.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I think the expansion of what is considered media is very interesting, and something the three of us have spoken about a lot is, what's considered media, what's considered a conversation. How do you look at things, both call it above the line or below the line? And for the purposes of this room, because you guys are obviously very sophisticated marketers, the fact that the line still exists is the most fucked up thing I've ever heard. But oh crap, we're recording.
Joey, edit it out.
My mom doesn't listen to the podcast. It's okay. But the fact that exists is kind of crazy. The fact that you guys take it from both a data-driven perspective, but like, how do you almost cross-pollinate the knowledge as you expand that shopper remit? The talent that you had on shopper maybe 5 years ago is going to be very different than the needs you have today, and the conversations that you have with the retailers previously on your 4 Ps is going to look very different when you include the M of media. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the simplest answer is we look to bring in talent that really have a growth mindset and are very curious and remain engaged with the industry and are asking lots of questions and kind of continuing to push into interesting spaces. So you're right, there's a lot of upskilling that takes place. And when you've got talent that is really excited about what's coming next, you're able to evolve and grow together in a very kind of organic way. And so that's, I think that's probably the biggest area of focus for us, is making sure we're bringing in that right talent so that we can all grow together.
I also feel that you have a particular point of view on talent, which is not about seniority.
Right.
I've watched you hire some mid-level people, stretch them, and they've rose through the ranks in the organization, or they go to Harvard and go get their MBA after Kraft. What is your view on seniority and leveling when you're hiring?
Yeah, I would say, we're always trying to kind of fill a pair of shoes, right? And if you can get it to 70 or 80% and you believe that somebody's got the right attitude and the right spirit and the right learning agility, that you would be willing to kind of grow and develop and help them get into that new role. But I agree with you. I'm not super interested in seniority. I'm not super interested in levels. I love to engage with my team at all levels because there's great ideas at all levels of an organization. And I typically find some of the best ideas with some of our, newer talent because, they've been in different spaces and they've had different experiences. And so I'm very excited to have all different kinds of conversations. And I create a lot of different forums to inspire that kind of feedback and that type of engagement. But yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting when you have somebody that's hungry and has that growth mindset and is really engaged and interested in growing, and to bet with them and to bet together, right? And people are betting on me, right? And so I think, that two-way street and having that two-way conversation in a really meaningful way is super important. And look, I want people to come and stay and to grow with me, right? I want to see those smiling faces every single day. And if we can continue to push the industry together and do best-in-class work, then we're going to be able to work together for a really long time. And, that's incredibly rewarding to me.
So let's talk about the industry for a second. You talked about how one of the biggest unlocks is the ability to align people internally.
Yes.
How is it showing up on the other side with the retailers? Are they showing up as a unified team?
Yeah. Of course, the answer is we're seeing a lot of different models when we're working with retail partners. But I would say that KraftHeinz's is really encouraging in our retail kind of conversations and discussions to bring all of those key leaders to the table. So I mentioned bringing the digital merchants, bringing the brick and mortar merchants, bringing kind of those media disciplines all together so that we can talk about what a big, bold idea might look like. What is that retail media investment? What's the impact that it might have on a brick and mortar category? What's the digital experience? What kind of an impact is that having in store as consumers are looking for products? How is content driving engagement both digitally and in store? There's so many interactions. There's so much cross-pollination. It's an ecosystem, right? And if we're talking in siloed channels, we're missing out on the opportunity to understand the interdependencies and the crossover of impact. So we are encouraging and having different levels of conversation, but are certainly a thought leader in driving that agenda and that objective to keep the consumer at the forefront and make sure we're bringing those best-in-class experiences through those conversations.
Can we dive deeper into data?
Yes.
I don't know if that's something you guys want. You guys want to talk about data? No, but I can't tell if that was a groan or a yes. Yes. Okay. I just saw one yes, and we're going with it. Well, I think one of the things is when you're going into these negotiations or partnership discussions or whatever it is, using data as a source of truth becomes extremely important. The problem is now everybody's trying to sell data.
Right.
How do you think about the way that you approach that, when the retailers are coming to you and saying, hey, we'd love to work with you, but you got to buy our data first. Or you have to make this commitment, that commitment, the other commitment, and also you can't trade between. Like, how do you deal with all that?
Right. When I think about data, fundamentally, it's the consumer's footprint. And if we're really focused on driving best-in-class consumer experiences and breakthrough consumer experiences, we've got to focus on how we unlock that consumer data in a meaningful way. So in my mind, the best-in-class partnerships are ones where we can come to really great agreements at the beginning of the year and unlock the data and unlock the insights in a comprehensive way where we're both bringing our resources together to have that complete conversation. And as you mentioned, where it falls apart is when, you know, we're stuck in this kind of like nickel and diming space where data is being withheld and it's in disparate spaces and it's disconnected, and, you know, we're fishing for certain, you know, facts or insights and we're getting, you know, all variations. Like, that's where we lose sight of the consumer and we lose sight of, you know, really getting to greatness on those solutions. So I think we have to partner together and figure out how we can unlock it, instead of creating all these barriers and hoops, because that's a short-term strategy, right? That over monetization, that focusing on just trying to, you know, turn a dollar. And I get that they're unique assets, right? Like, I understand the value and the importance, but how do we get to that long-term focus and that long-term strategy, so that we can do what's best?
But when is it over monetization versus just monetization? Is that greed? Like, what's the trigger point for an over monetization? I mean,
I think it's the complexity of how the agreements are being put together. And we certainly, as brands, want to make investments and we want to collaborate together and build plans together, which is fantastic. And we want to have a big conversation at a point in time and then, you know, allow the teams to do great work over an extended period of time. But if we are constantly kind of discussing the new capability that's launching and the cost of the new availability and, you know, all of these dimensions, you know, kind of pop up sporadically throughout the year and are driving complexity in the work, I don't think that's serving our long-term ambition of really driving, you know, a best-in-class consumer experience.
Now, I don't know if you'll kiss and tell, but a customer said to me last week, they were stack ranking retailers. Mm-hmm. And they go, Amazon gives us a fire hose of data. Mm. Kroger, a little bit less, but still a good amount of data. Then Walmart, then Target round out. And obviously there's, you know, thousands of other retailers. Do you have a perspective on which retailer is a great partner or where you feel the ecosystem is heading? Is Amazon's move going to make it more open source in the future?
Well, that's a tough question.
We only do tough questions.
Despite this being a Brave Commerce podcast. No, I mean, I'm not going to kiss and tell. I think that, you know, there are, you know, as you just described, a lot of different dynamics, and it does come down to the partnership. So I don't even know that there is a uniform kind of way to define each of the retailers. It does come down to kind of how you've partnered and the conversations and relationships that you have. And, you know, I think probably the single most important thing is having transparent, vulnerable conversations with them where you're getting face-to-face and you're talking the real talk about what's working, right? You know, when I think about the definition of attribution, you know, like, are we really talking about the same calculation or are we talking about 15 versions of the calculation and no one agrees? Like, let's get to the same language first. And I did that last week. I was out at a customer. I won't name the customer, but that was the first thing I said is like, we do not have a common definition of attributed ROI. And I think that's the first most important thing that we need to get on the same page with. And once you actually have those direct conversations, then you can get to solutions. But if we're all going to talk like we're talking about the same thing and we're not, like, it's really hard to move the needle. So that's where those vulnerable, transparent, direct conversations are where we build our most robust relationships and we have our best partnerships and we're able to do the most work.
I mean, one of the things we've been talking about a lot is in the advertising business, there are so many trade groups, right? You've got the 4 A's, the ANA, the IAB, the ABC, the DEF. You got them all. In the retail media business, it is a little bit still Wild West. And then if you're in a global role, it's even more complicated because the rules of engagement in, you know, the UK is going to be different than France, is going to be different than Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we're in America right now, so let's talk about the US. Even with that, it does feel a little bit like that moment in The Princess Bride where Vicini says inconceivable, and the man in black says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." and it does feel like words like attribution or ROAS do not mean what you think it means. Like, how do you set the standard for the totality of your media partnerships?
Yeah. I think first it's internally understanding what we believe to be are the truths behind the definitions and what best in class looks like. And and often that is a robust and rowdy discussion internally where we are getting aligned on what this really means. But once we align, then it's going forward and saying, okay, here, again, having those direct conversations, here's how we're calculating it. Here's why we're not including category halo in our ROI calculation, and why base sales matter. And, we get into the particulars of how we're thinking about it. And then again, we need to come to alignment on the calculations and make sure that as a brand, we're getting what we need. And that, we're kind of finding the sweet spot of how we can operate together. Because fundamentally, we need to be able to operate and have that common language to be able to move with speed throughout the year.
When Rachel and I both, Rachel got into the commerce space years before I did, but once I finally realized she was onto something, one of the things that really got me excited about this space, and it just goes back to many years in marketing, is how close you are to the actual sale. And what drives me crazy is that we still don't even have the right language, the right nomenclature specifically on identifying what these things should be. And it's like, well, did you buy the product? Did you not buy the product? Does it have to be that complicated? Right. And the truth is, in 2020, it wasn't that complicated because nobody was walking into a store. So an e-com sale was an e-com sale. Right. Now there's this world of digitally influenced sales. Mm-hmm. You're in the store, you're rolling your cart down the aisle, you take out your phone and you're comparing two different products by looking at product reviews. How do you think about that idea of a digitally influenced sale versus hardcore performance? I saw this, I bought this.
Yeah. And I think that ties into this idea of like brand and retailer and other partners upskilling each other. There continues to be a huge opportunity for us to drive progress in this kind of mix analysis space. It's super interesting for our teams. We talk a lot about kind of like predictive modeling and understanding all of those interdependencies. And I think it all comes into the conversation. We just want transparency around what is being included and how it's being calculated so that we can talk about the different ROIs and the different returns, that you're seeing. So it's just transparency around it. It's all fair game and it all can be included, but breaking that down. And then let's not get too complex so that we can enable our teams to move quickly. But that modeling is a really interesting space. And I think that's the direction we need to head in, is some great testing, smarter testing, and getting into predictive modeling so that we can move faster.
We could have a whole session on attribution because it is changing at rapid pace. But we have to ask you our famous last question, which is, what's the bravest thing you've ever done?
Well, you may not be surprised based on the path that this conversation took. But I would say the bravest thing is something that I actually try to do every single day. And it is living and operating in a way that is truly consistent with my values. And one of those values that's incredibly important to me is the way I treat and operate and work with people. And, at KraftHeinz, we talk a lot about bringing humanity back into the workplace. Today we talked about kind of that holistic consumer experience. And I think not very differently, like we need to treat each other as whole people when we come into the office. And, so for me, sometimes it's a difficult thing. Sometimes it's not the most popular thing. Sometimes it requires you to check your ego. But when I'm thinking about my day, I don't think there's anything more important that I do. So that's the bravest thing I do.
We have felt it. We appreciate your partnership, being on the podcast. Folks, please listen on Apple, iHeart, Spotify. Where else are we distributed?
Wherever you can find the podcast.
Wherever you can find the podcast.
You'll find us.
And thank you again.
Absolutely. Pleasure being here. Thanks, everyone.